that's okay. Okay, sorry about that. Technical challenges. Yeah, so like I said, the topic of the day is facilitating green recovery and development in Africa. And we're looking at the global justice and knowledge perspectives. Human beings are dramatically changing the surface conditions on planet Earth at a very fast rate. And one key aspect of this is pollution. Our emission of particles as well as ozone cause massive damage through breathing, which already accounts for some 8.7 million human deaths annually, about 15% of the global total. Plastic pollution soils the air, land, ground, water, and oceans, killing countless animals and causing cancers in human beings. There's also emissions of greenhouse gases that accumulate in our atmosphere and drive a relentless heating of air, land, and oceans. Through water expansion and melting ice, this heating raises sea levels with loss of low-lying lands and salinization of groundwater. Other land areas become too hot for human habitation, frequently devastated by extreme weather events or infested with invasive pests or diseases. All this disrupts food production, thus aggravating undernourishment and poverty, and also cause extinction of thousands of animal and plant species. So we have all manner of problems that affect human beings. But another thing to note here is that while we observe these effects, they don't impact human beings at the same rate or in the same way. There are dramatic discrepancies on the contribution side. For example, electricity consumption is about 160 times higher per capita in the US than in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So one person in the US uses 160 times times electricity in the US compared to a person in the Republic of Congo. That's from the contribution side. So while pollution is supposed to hit everybody, it is not shared, both in terms of contribution as well as impact in the same way. So this is a justice problem that others have likened to slavery. The issue is that the responses that have been mooted so far are inadequate. For example, the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals are inadequate for addressing environmental degradation at the speed required. They demand far too little from the affluent, and the efforts they demand are often absurdly inefficient. The Paris Agreement focuses each state's attention on emissions within its own territory. Thus, a highly industrialized state is considered to have made progress when goods consumed in it are now imported, okay? So that the pollution associated with their production now occurs in some faraway poor country rather than domestically. So we clearly have a lot to deal with. And to address the issue at hand, I have a panel of 3 experts. Professor Thomas Pogge, who is the Leitner Professor of Philosophy and International Affairs at Yale University, and also Director of the Global Justice Program at Yale University. We also have Dr. Emmanuel Nyadzi, originally from Ghana, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Wageningen University and Research in Gelderland province of the Netherlands. Our third expert to treat the topic is Dr. Francois Kabore, a Jesuit, who is a knowledge economics expert from Kosiam Jesuit University in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. Our 3 experts will speak one after the other, after which we shall have a chance for discussion. The chat is already open for, if you have any questions for them, you can post them there as they arise. We will intentionally put you on mute. Don't get frustrated. So if you want to express anything or ask a question or make a comment, just post it in the chat and we shall read your comment or questions and allow the interveners to respond to your question. So right away, for a start, I'm going to invite Professor Thomas Pogge to speak to us. He's speaking from a hospital bed, but he's okay to talk to us. Yeah. Thank you, Thomas. Welcome. He's on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So the main points have already been mentioned by Charlie. And basically, we have a climate emergency, which is highlighted in particular by air pollution, which is deadly, PM 2.5 particles, and also ozone pollution are enormous problems, very life-shortening. In Europe, 14 million years are lost every year, life years are lost every year. So this is already an enormously important problem. And of course, there is the even more important problem of global warming, which will occupy us for the rest of this decade. I should say that you're all welcome to share this PowerPoint presentation afterwards, so you don't need to take notes or anything. I'm more than happy to let you all have a look at it. So the main things, again, Charles already mentioned. Sea level rise is a major threat, unbearable heat in the tropics, lack of food and water, more frequent extreme weather events, spread of tropical diseases, and the extinction of many plant and animal species. These are the problems that are caused by global warming, which in turn is caused by the emission of greenhouse gases. CO2 is the most important one, but there's methane and there are a dozen others that are also increasing the amount of heat from the sun that is retained in the human atmosphere. Now, this crisis is in a way an opportunity because the problem is much bigger than the cost of averting it. So if you think of humanity as one family, it's very, very obvious what we should do. We should spend a little effort to avert the problem and thereby save much, much larger costs later on. The problem, as Charles already indicated, is that we are not really all sitting in the same boat. We are not really all members of the same family, more or less equally affected by climate change. The global rich have a lot more to lose in dollar terms. They lose billions and trillions of dollars. The value of all the fossil fuel reserves in the world is about $150 trillion. So that's $150,000 billion. And the owners of these fossil fuels will lose the value of any fuels that remain in the ground. And also, those same global rich people have a lot to lose from a different lifestyle. They have private planes, they have yachts, they waste a huge amount of fossil fuels on their lifestyle, and they might have to change their lifestyle quite dramatically if we get serious about climate change. They're also relatively invulnerable. So if climate change happens, if it gets very hot, these people have passports. They can go to New Zealand, they can go to Canada, they can have air conditioning anywhere they go, they can filter the air to breathe clean air, and so on. So they are very differently positioned from the ordinary person in the world, like the rickshaw driver in Bangladesh or the agricultural laborer in the Congo. So what is the conventional way to think about such collective action problem? If some people have a lot to lose from climate change and other people have less to lose, then the way to achieve cooperation is those who have a lot to lose pay money to those who have less to lose in order to buy their collaboration. Now, in the case of climate change, that's a ridiculous solution. One difficulty is that there are some very, very big gainers from business as usual who would need to be paid billions and even trillions of dollars to compensate them for their losses in terms of not being able to use their fossil fuels. Then you have the fact that many of the people who are most vulnerable to climate change are very poor. And even 1 million or 1 billion very poor people do not have enough money to pay off the few rich people who are owners of these fossil fuel reserves. Okay, can I be heard?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, that something went wrong with, I was muted for a moment. So, and then there is the problem of future generations who cannot give any reward to those who are presently giving up their fossil fuel reserves. So the standard collective action solution that you simply make side payments from the more vulnerable to the less vulnerable is not feasible. The only way to solve this problem is a moral solution, and that's what I want to talk about for the rest of the time. So the solution that we already have is the Paris Agreement of December 2015, where all the nations came together and agreed that the temperature would never go above 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. Now, the fact that they all agree doesn't mean it will happen. And of course, it will not happen because we already, if we look at all the intended nationally determined contributions, can expect a temperature increase of 2.7 degrees by the year 2100. The commitments that were made by countries were simply not enough to achieve the agreed upon target. And since then, things have become even worse because Australia and the US have said that they no longer want to participate in the process. So here's another way in which we can solve the problem. And this is a moral solution that has 3 elements. First, we define a declining glide path that limits future emissions enough to avert the catastrophe. So we say each year we have to emit less greenhouse gases than we did in the previous year, and we have to find a glide path that keeps us below 1.5 degrees, or maybe more realistically, below 2 degrees. Secondly, we have to allocate these limits fairly over the various generations so that each generation bears a fair share of the burden. And then we have to allocate each generation's burden fairly among contemporaries. This was the basic idea of the Oslo Principles, which I worked on with a group of international lawyers, and we presented that as the best interpretation of existing international law: human rights law, tort law, private law, environmental law, and international law, all combined together to say what legal constraints are states already under in view of the fact that if they continue business as usual, we will have a major catastrophe in which human rights will be massively violated. There is a fourth desideratum, and that is that the solution should also encourage the involved agents to focus their contributions on large and cost-effective emissions reductions. Those of you who know economics, the metaphor is that of the low-hanging fruits. We should spend our effort and our money where it can make the biggest difference to emissions and global warming. Now, let me go through the 3 points. The glide path means humanity must reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a certain percentage each year, such that we stay below the 2-degree target. According to present science, this percentage is 5%, roughly. So if we reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 5% a year, every year, then we have a good chance of staying below the 2-degree ceiling. But now the human population is growing by about 1% each year. And that means that the per capita emissions have to fall faster than the total emissions. The per capita emissions have to fall by about 6% a year in order to achieve a 5% reduction in the total emissions, simply because there are more and more people every year. So the per capita glide path for humanity is a reduction of 6% in per capita emissions every year. And this glide path holds for humanity, and it also holds for all countries. Every country has to stay below that ceiling, has to get below it and stay below it, reducing each year by 6%. So in the moment, the ceiling is 5 tons of CO2 per person per year, but it goes down by 6% each year in the future, and countries have to catch that glide path and stay below it. So here you can see it, that states ought to reduce their emissions below this glide path that reduces by 6% a year. This is for CO2, which is the most important greenhouse gas. Other greenhouse gases are different, and there the reductions are proportionate. They're also 6%, but from lower levels. So if we do that, we will reach 2 tons per capita per year in the year 2035, and 1 in the more distant future. Now, it's very difficult for states that are now emitting 16 tons per person to get below the 5 ton per person ceiling. And so the Oslo Principles allow that states can make offsetting efforts in other countries. So a country that is now at 16, like for example, the United States, a country like the United States that is currently emitting 16 tons per capita per year, if it cannot get down to 5 overnight, which it cannot, it has to make compensating efforts in other countries that are below the ceiling to keep them from increasing rapidly. Basically, efforts to green other countries. This is the demand that I think Africa should make on the rich world. Africa should say, we are polluting much less than the ceiling. You are polluting much more than the ceiling. What you ought to do is, if you cannot get right down to the ceiling overnight, is help us pay the difference for us to start our development in a green way, to create green traffic system, green cement, green steel, green electricity production. And that sort of funding and sharing of technology is what I think we should expect from the richer countries. One thing that is very important here is intellectual property, innovation. As you know, people who innovate are entitled to patents. And if they have a patent, they can veto the use of their innovation. Everybody who wants to use the innovation has to pay for it. And that is really quite silly, because what it means is that many poorer populations will not use the green innovation. They will simply say, we will do without it because we don't really have the money. We cannot really afford to pay these patenting fees. That hurts not only the poor people, it hurts the whole world, because we all suffer the consequences of increased pollution. So the proposal for the countries that are above the glide path is that one thing they should together do is fund an ecological impact fund that would give green innovators the option to allow their innovation to be used without cost, but they would still get paid for their innovation in proportion to the ecological impact they achieve with it. This would completely invert the normal incentives. The normal incentive for an innovator is to be a jealous person who looks everywhere in the world. Is somebody using my invention without permission? I don't want anybody to use my invention without paying me. In this case, it would be the other way around. The more people use my invention, the more money I get, the more I am rewarded for the greenhouse gases that my invention keeps out of the atmosphere. So, of course, the ecological impact fund needs to be funded, needs to be paid for, and that is something that I suggest the rich countries should do in compensation for the fact that they will be, for the foreseeable future, still above the glide path. I conclude then that a high standard of living is possible for all human beings, including those who are presently living in poverty, and all human beings can consume ample energy which is derived from renewable sources, from sun, from water, wind, the tides, from the waves, from geothermal installations. We can provide energy for everybody, but we have to do it in a green way if we are going to save our planet. A world without fossil fuels can be far more worthwhile than our world has been before industrialization. The last thought is that this moral solution, of course, will impose significant sacrifices on the super rich. I have no problem with this at all, but we have to be aware of the fact that the super rich will do everything in their power to get compensated. They will allow a solution to the climate problem only if they get compensated. And this can remind us of the old abolition of slavery, where exactly the same thing happened. The abolition did not happen until the slave owners got compensation. And you may know that an incredible amount of money was paid by the British government to slaveholders, and they took out a huge debt for that, which they completely paid off only in 2015. Many of the big famous families in Britain are families that got rich from this compensation. I hope we will not have to compensate a lot, but we have to reckon with the fierce resistance of the super rich to any kind of moral solution to the climate problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. He has raised very important global justice issues, helping us to pay attention to the fact that the current solutions are inadequate and that we need to find solutions that are more moral in nature. And especially proposed a very important pathway to development there for the transfer of resources from the north to the south in order to promote greening of development in the south, as well as an environmental impact fund to be funded by richer nations that could help turn intellectual property into something that is not focused too much on profits, but is focused on the impact it is making in alleviating poverty. Thank you very much, Thomas. Right away, we shall go to the next speaker, Dr. Emmanuel Nyadzi. Go ahead, Dr. Emmanuel.
I think you're muted.
He can unmute himself. Unmute yourself. Can you unmute?
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Hello?
We can hear you now.
Good, thank you. All right, thank you so much for inviting me to express my opinion on this rather important topic. And I would like to elaborate a bit more on the solutions as to how we'll be able to implement this green development and how government should mobilize themselves in doing this. Professor Thomas has really thrown a deeper light on the whole problem, of which I think has set the pace for some of us to add up also. It is obvious that African over the years have experienced economic growth, but then this economic growth remains uninclusive, and also it also affects the environment. So whilst a lot of people have improved in income levels and also a lot have come out of poverty, there is also the need that we actually look at the impact that the environment will have on the well-being of people and how inclusive it is. So the continent is trying to, there's been a call on the continent to create new development pathways so they'll be able to harness the natural resources and the people on the continent. Of course, Africans, GDP, large part of GDP, largely rely on the natural resources available. And so in trying to create these pathways, we ensure that there will be better jobs for people, there will be sustainable growth, and also poverty will be alleviated, inequalities will expand, and well-being of people, as well as industrialization of the continent being boosted. Now, the question is, what do we need? How are we going to go about it? Like it's indicated, that green growth is the one sure way to get through this process of sustaining our development. And this is because it ensures economic growth and also maintain and also encourage social and environmental sustainability. So there is need for us to shift towards a more greener environment or more greener economic development model that will help us in sustaining and making a more development goals that are inclusive. So the question then is, what about us grow now and then clean up later argument? There is an argument that, of course, we can focus on economic growth now and as Africans, and then later we think about the environmental consequences. Others say we can do otherwise by looking at environmental sustainability issues and then focus more on the economic implication. But I say that, and many other thoughts-provoking scientists or researchers or scholars have indicated that this approach is inefficient. And it's inefficient because we can't actually focus on the whole public good. The atmosphere, for example, is expansion of gases. Whatever you do in point A can affect your other neighbor who may be vulnerable to this impact. Also, the impact of this degradation on the national economic growth will also be very devastating. China is, for example, a country that actually have had a lot of growth, 10% growth per year for the last 3 decades. But now they are actually facing environmental degradation consequences. It's estimated that about 9% of its GDP is threatened. And not only that, they are now becoming, the economic competitiveness of China also remain something that they have to relook at, the welfare of the people. And because of this, there has been calls to actually find alternative way to actually improve the growth. So Africa need to go green, and they need to go green as soon as possible and not wait until we grow economically and then later reverse into environmental sustainability. So what do we do now as a continent if we think that green economy or green growth is really the surest way? We need to start investing in green. And in investing in greens, we're talking about innovations and technology that have the characteristics of protecting the environment and also ensuring that there is less pollution and resources are used in a more sustainable manner. And the investment should not only be on technologies and innovations alone, but even knowledge and management system that will influence the behavioral changes of individuals, especially those actors who are working in the food, housing, and mobility area. Moreover, there is also the need that we don't look at these technologies and innovations as an individual system, but a total overall system where we include the technical know-how of the individuals, the production designs, and then also the processes, and then the organization and managerial procedures must all be factored into it. So the first thing we need to do as a continent is that let's explore existing local innovation. And in exploring existing local innovation, we also have to move forward to try to protect this local innovation and technology. Professor Thomas mentioned of supporting intellectual property rights. And if these local people, the people in the continent, entrepreneurs and IT experts, innovations are being protected, then indeed they'll get benefits and also think of ways of bringing out innovative ideas to solve the climate emissions or the challenges we face as a continent. Now, where these technologies are not available, indeed, we can actually import this technology, but we should ensure that the process is owned locally and also indigenous people's ideas and knowledge are integrated into the entire process. It is important that whilst we transfer these technology innovations, we should ensure that this includes not only the innovation, but even the entire human resource development and the capacity building of the local people, including gender-related issues. Certain technologies may not be favorable for certain kind of gender. And so we look at these things in all these under these lenses. There is a need to also ensure that these technologies, as they are being transferred, must be compatible with national and socioeconomic and cultural priorities of the continent, of the countries in which they are being imported into. So when we invest in green, when we invest in green, it's expected that we are surely going to promote sustainable infrastructures. We are going to sustain our natural resources. We are also going to build resilience for rather poor and people living in rural communities and even in urban cities as well. So how do we ensure that we promote sustainable infrastructure? There's need for us to invest as a continent on renewable and low energy systems. So if you go to a village, most of these community members rely on improved stoves and cleaner fuels. Rely on stoves and fuels in cooking. But when we actually improve these, there is a possibility that there will be sanitation will be improved, there's health services will be improved, and also the well-being, especially women who use this fuel, will also improve. And also sustainable transport system. It is high time as a continent we begin to avoid the excessive use of cars on our streets and rather move directly into perhaps rail, but so that we reduce the number of people. But even if better, places that we can easily access, we use bicycles and start walking, which will give us a bit of good health, at the same time saving costs and reducing emission on the continent. Now, water transport is one way also. Now, there's African Development Bank, for example, is currently carrying out a first feasibility study so that they can reopen the Shai Zambezi waterway that is connecting between Zimbabwe and Malawi, so that significant shift from road transport to river transport will be something that will help also in reducing green gases. Our societies, urban cities, our communities should also be eco-friendly. And when we make them green, there is a need that we are going to benefit from economic growth. At the same time, we ensure environmental benefits, and even the social benefits are enormous. There'll be equity, everybody having access to a healthy environment. Now, moving on to the natural management of our resources, how sustainable it's going to be. There's afforestation of our degradable lands. There's need to invest in those. And not only that, when we do this, we expect that these lands will become productive in the future. There's one of the activities being carried out by Father Kweni, a Jesuit himself, with its youth network at Aropi Jesuit Institute in Ghana. Also, sustainable mining. There are responsible mining activities happening in communities. So this river is called the Pra, and you can see an image of it before and after. There is need for us to invest in sustainable and clean technologies for the mining sector so that we can prevent destruction of water bodies and even destruction of land cover and changes. Agriculture is predominant on the continent with a lot of people involved in it, but it's high time as a continent we think about ways to make this sustainable. We need to reduce chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And not only that, even when you're encouraging organic farming can also be unsustainable sometimes, depending on how efficient you use water and how efficient you use the resources available. And there is also need for less emission in animal husbandry. A lot of people in African communities or rural communities have animals. Here in Wageningen, for example, there is research being carried out to ensure that animals that are able to emit when at their adult stage are eliminated even at the point of birth. So they take certain genetic parameters and model them, and then they will estimate how much emission such animal will be able to emit when it grows. So the animal can be eliminated at the birth, so they don't invest in feeding it and then later on become environmentally unfriendly. Such technologies and innovation can be transferred to Africa as well. Doing this will also build the resilience of the people in our continent. Clean and potable water provided to rural folks. An example is a life sack. Now, this technology is multi-purpose. People use it for transporting grains and also for filtering water and storing water. It uses an ultraviolet radiation technology to disinfect contaminants from water. So, and not only that, wetlands need to be developed. We need to invest in wetlands. So what happens in Mozambique and certain part of and its neighboring countries, the cyclones, assuming there's a lot of water, wetlands that have been developed, they can reduce the direct impact of the waves that are moving from the ocean. And not only that, forests can reduce erosion, we can also keep water free from sediments. There is also a call for building dams, but the question I ask often is that, are dams really the best way to store or save water? And why do I say this? Because dams may store a lot of water, but indeed there can also be a lot of water that is lost through evaporation and seepage. It's estimated about 50,000 liters of water is lost in summer in Australia, as when they look at 1 hectare of water surface. So you can imagine, and even dams' lifespan can also be constrained by the sedimentation or the amount of soil that is being eroded into the water over a period. So instead, we need to focus on water use efficiency, having an effective irrigation layout with drip irrigation, where the right amount of water is given to the right crop and at the right time. Not only that, we need to train people. There is also a tendency for us to, there's also opportunity for us to explore groundwater that can also augment and reuse in our farming communities and areas that need it. Now, when we invest in green, there's a possibility that we can reduce household costs, because now if most farmers, the high percentage of their budget is spent on food, water, energy, and transport, not only for communities that are rural, but even urban cities. So if you provide green light, source of light, if you provide transportation that need not to be based on use of petroleum and oil, even if the prices of these items are high, these communities will still remain strong because they are not affected by those external prices on these commodities. So as part of these investments, the question that remains is that how can African countries promote green growth? What can we do as continents? Now, there is a need for political commitment and leadership. The leadership need to create an enabling environment for the right private sector involvement. Now, when I'm talking about enabling environment, I'm talking about subsidy reforms, ecological taxes, regulatory frameworks, and standard that will ensure that companies that comes in savvy or investment and stick to certain standards, and also come with certain technologies that are environmentally friendly. Now, success of these will depend on the credibility of regulatory system. Africa needs to strengthen its institutions and the compliance mechanism systems, especially the judiciary system. So if people have issues, they are rest assured that they will be able to get justice in this court system. Not only that, the court system also able to provide justice for the benefit of majority of the people in the continent. Proper valuing of nature in decision making. The problem has been that we actually don't even know the actual value we obtain from nature. So there is need for us to come out with mechanism and methodologies to measure green transformation. How much green jobs are we creating? What are we going to benefit from it? And not only that, can we also decouple the economic productivity from, or can we separate economic productivity from human well-being? Can we be able to estimate these things in isolation? And not only that, we need to also measure the well-being of people if we go green. When we have idea on how poverty will be reduced, social equity and social inclusiveness will be improved, then people will be ready. Governments and institutions, partners and private organizations will be ready to also invest in that. Recently, around 8th June, there was a paper that was published by UK and then the Chinese researchers, and they did come out with a gross ecosystem product. And this product is expected to measure the nature and achieving sustainable development. So we need transparent methodologies and processes to be able to quantify this. There is need to also mainstream green growth into national economic agenda and strategies. Rwanda, Ethiopia have mainstream green economy already into their development goals and strategies. At a national level, Kenya has committed to actualizing 100% transition to green energy by 2020. South Africa is also in the process of transiting into a purely renewable energy system. So these countries and many others are making effort, but then all the other countries need to rally around these ideas. So we'll be able to ensure that our continents go green and obtain the necessary output. It's important for us to know that investing in green infrastructure has a high initial cost, although the long run there is benefit. So we need to actually, if we don't support private sectors, we don't support African governments, there is need that they are likely to shift to the unsustainable environmental investment. And by so doing, there's need for public and private financing and cheaper technology and innovation transfer from developed communities. And so that Africa could be able to implement these growth. I would like to conclude by saying that Africa's ecological footprint, as indicated by Professor Thomas already, is very low, but most vulnerable to the climate changes indeed Africans, and more particularly people who are poor and do not have enough adaptive capacity to manage this impact. So today, more than ever, I would like to say that we need to pay attention to green growth because it is a holistic development that focuses on providing a more efficient and affordable environmental, social, and economic growth. Now, green growth, let's not assume that it's inclusive by itself. But so when we are trying to come out with policies that will promote green growth, we need to find out how these are designed in a way to maximize benefit and minimize costs for the poor people and the most vulnerable in our society. The main challenge for green growth is also about constrained by social and political apathy. Less number of governments have apathy towards green growth. Of course, they may have their reasons, and most of it because of financing, but we need to support, we need to encourage governments in Africa to shift their attention to green growth. There is also within country sectoral collaboration so that there will be no need for us to create trade-offs, but rather increase our synergy among countries. For Africa to achieve green growth, I would like to say the international community and the developed nation need to also support. And this can be in the form of knowledge, technology, transfer, and funding of projects. So these are some of the practical issues that I think that, I know there are many others that we as Africans or as a continent can adopt to improve green growth in our continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Emmanuel is a member of the Jesuit Justice and Ecology Network, which is hosting this webinar. He's doing work in the Netherlands there, but he is a national of Ghana. He has addressed very pertinent points, focusing on Africa as his level of analysis, proposing a few things that could be done, especially he pointed to the need for knowledge development in Africa in order to respond to the crisis we are facing. And where that knowledge development is not possible, he proposed knowledge transfer. But he also paid attention to the fact that for all of these good things to happen, there is need for political will, strong institutional frameworks, and also more innovative ways of valuing the ecosystem products and goods and things that nature provides, away from our anthropocentric attitudes. And he's also mentioned, proposed that we pay attention to equity issues, paying attention to the fact that green growth may not be as inclusive as we think. There are issues of finance that we have to pay attention to, and anything else that should make this process more equitable as well as more inclusive. Thank you very much. Right away, I'll ask Francois Kabore to make his presentation. You can unmute yourself, your co-host.
Hello, can you?
Yeah, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, can you see my screen so far? Can you see my screen?
It's coming, it's still white, it's coming.
Do you have it now? No.
We can see a white screen.
A white screen?
Yes.
How about this one? Can you see my screen?
Yeah, but it's still blank, it's still white.
Wow. Okay, let me start again.
Yes.
You get it?
Yeah. You can maybe take it to slideshow.
Are you good?
Yeah.
Okay. So, is it there?
Yes. You're good.
Okay, good. Okay, sorry for this. So first of all, I want to thank you all for the opportunity to share these few words about the topic of green recovery and growth in Africa, global justice and knowledge perspective. And I'm very grateful to my co-panelists, Professor Thomas and Dr. Emmanuel, for their insights. I would like to build on their insights and share, I would say, 3 points. First, suggesting a few working definitions, and then focusing on the knowledge perspectives. And of course, suggesting a few solutions building around how to educate differently for green development. So first of all, in the context of the COVID-19, as you all know, the perspectives of growth are pretty, let's say, difficult for Africa, because according to the IMF reports, we are certainly to experience the first negative growth in Africa for the last 25 or so years. And we are expected to go down to -2% growth in Africa. But why is that the case? because mostly what we call green growth is the type of growth that is built on sustainable use of natural resources for the increase in wealth production within a country. On the other side, when we look at what is projected in terms of commodity prices, we would see that most commodities are going to decrease. Their prices are going to decrease. However, we may have a few other commodities such as coal, coffee, gold, whose prices are going to still keep rising. However, all these are raw materials, which is not really what we want to focus on if we want to focus on green growth. And when we talk about justice perspective, from my point of view, I would just consider it as the optimal allocation or fair allocation of produced wealth, of the wealth produced within the country, which means that we really want to focus on inclusive growth, that is a type of growth that also lifts up the most or the poorest within the country. And according to the definition from the World Bank, we call inclusive growth the growth that benefits the bottom 40%, for example, of the population. However, as I mentioned, my talk is going to focus on the knowledge perspective. What do we mean by the knowledge perspective is how we want to use knowledge as an input for development instead of raw material. Because when we talk about Africa most of the time, we want to say, well, in order to improve the growth perspective of Africa, we need to produce X and Z, but all these are, I would say, organized around raw material. But how do we want to get out of that? We can do this if we want to use knowledge as an input, knowledge it being this increase in capacity in terms of empowering the people and the nations to create wealth. And when we do so, it translates into innovation and technology, and also value-added creation. And when we talk about technology, of course, we may think about technology transfer, but beyond that, I'm going to focus on the indigenous production of technology. So in terms of knowledge perspective and justice, if we want to look at it from the macro perspective, the first point is to focus on collaboration. And I think my two colleagues have already mentioned the importance of, let's say, North-South collaboration. But again, the danger of a macro perspective in terms of knowledge production is to think only of knowledge transfer. Knowledge transfer is very, very important, and we want to focus also on knowledge capacity building within Africa. But beyond knowledge transfer and absorptive capacity, we want to look at knowledge co-creation. Otherwise, what would happen is that we want to consider Africa only as a consumer of the knowledge produced in other parts of the world, which actually is a replication of the current paradigms that is happening within the commodity market, and we want to translate it into the knowledge market also. And so if we want to kind of shift paradigms, instead of just focusing on knowledge transfer and absorptive capacity and so on, the conditions of possibility of this shifting of paradigms is to educate differently Africa. And to do so, I would like to show a few examples. From the macro perspective, if we want to focus on commodity prices, this is based on a study I did in Ivory Coast for the Academy of Sciences, focusing on the value chain of cashew nuts, because since 2016, Ivory Coast has become the first producing country for cashew nut, as they are already the first producing country for cocoa and so on. But I showed to them that actually in the value chain of cashew nuts, only 1% of the price or the value goes to the producer. 5% of the value goes to the producer. 1% goes to the wholesale people, those who are buying and reselling it like the cooperatives and so on. But 29% of the value go to those who are doing the exports and the logistics. And you know what? 65% of the value goes to those who are doing transformation. That is, these people are not focusing on tangible and raw material. They are focusing on intangible and value creation. This is at the macro level. If you go at the micro, at individual level, the current paradigms on which Africa is working leads Africans to actually a lot of unemployment because according to the study done by the African Development Bank, the more you are educated in Africa, the more you are likely to be unemployed, which means you are not going to be contributing into value creation within your country. And you can see that you are better off actually being, let's say, educated at primary level because your likelihood of being unemployed is 13%, than having higher education, because if you are educated at higher education level, your likelihood of being unemployed as a man is 34%, but is 48% for women, which means that our current education is failing us. And to give you an example at a country level, because this is at a macro level, at a country level, I compiled the data for Burkina Faso. And when we are doing, let's say, a competition for jobs, for 2019, the government needed only 5,892 people, or let's say they were opening for 5,000 seats. Well, we had more than 1,200,000 people competing. On a graph, to make it easy to see, it means that we actually have only jobs for 0.4% people who are competing for a job. I mean, if you are educating that way, you're not going to go anywhere close to green development or, let's say, innovation or technology. So if you want to educate differently, we actually need to focus on a kind of entrepreneurial type of education where people are going to be empowered to create wealth within their countries using green resources, using renewable resources. And to do so, as I mentioned, we need to educate differently. For example, there are studies, and I have conducted that and presented that in many, many conferences, whereby we can see that actually, if we build an ecosystem that promotes value creation, it is possible to induce green development. And to do so, we need an ecosystem of knowledge. And what we call knowledge ecosystem means an ecosystem within which the government and the ministries, the public sector, creates the right environment. Professor Thomas has mentioned property rights and so on, and the universities has to do the right type of education, because as for now, we cannot really say that the current education system is really helping Africa. And companies, that is the private sector, has also to be involved in green technology. Currently, most business people in Africa go to Asia or in other parts of the world to go buy and come and sell. We are just making Africa a market for some other people. So in conclusion, what I want to mean here is that from the macro perspective, we need a paradigm shift. And this paradigm shift means going from exogenous type of development to an endogenous type of development, which means going from our needs to create the right education to create value. And to do so, we need to stop running our economies based on raw material. And if we stop doing that, it means that we can start thinking in terms of knowledge-based economy. And the good thing about that is that knowledge is unlimited in comparison to raw material that is actually very limited, because you can outsource, you can deplete all your natural resources. But if you build your economy on knowledge, it's completely unlimited. And the good thing about that is that even for your raw material, you can use it in a sustainable way. And from the micro perspective, that is at the individual level, it means educating differently. As for now, within our countries, we are educating people for public services and for wage jobs. We are not educating people to create value. So this is what I wanted to share with you, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you. Hello?
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you very much, Francois, for that very good presentation. He paid attention to the value of knowledge, proposing that Africa needs to take knowledge seriously, move our economies from being commodity-based to pay attention to creating knowledge and pay much attention to its value. And he proposed a way of building that knowledge through what he called educating differently, promoting entrepreneurship, but not just at individual level. He proposed the building up of ecosystems of knowledge that involve universities, the business sector, the governments, and other players. He's also proposed a shift toward homegrown development, or what he called endogenous development, so that we own it, it's valuable to us, and we can sustain it and run it for ourselves. And finally, he shifted our attention to the fact that most of our jobs, job creation is focused on wage jobs in the public sector mostly. He proposed ways of promoting jobs that are entrepreneurial in nature and knowledge based. Thank you very much. We already have some questions. The first question, it can be answered by any of the three panelists. It says, I frequently read and hear from economists. Examples given are Herman Daly, Gao Giraud, that banks create money and the states are supposed to regulate this creation. Is it not possible for African countries to set up their own banks for the good of local companies? The next question is, this one is addressed to Professor Thomas. He spoke about the global justice dimensions of the topic under discussion. Are there any proposals for engaging the powerful nations with their selfish interests by the southern countries? And I guess other panelists can also comment on that. The third question for the first set says, in a continent often permeated with religious influences, what could an interfaith perspective bring to greening economies and greening investment? What are the weaknesses of religious institutions in this field? Maybe we can start with those three. I will ask Thomas to go first. Oh, I've seen a note, Thomas, as you know, Thomas was speaking from his hospital bed. He was hospitalized last night. So he may be being attended to by doctors. Maybe Emmanuel, you want to start. You can unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself, Emmanuel, and go ahead.
I think Professor Thomas is asking you to unmute him.
Oh.
Yes, it's online.
It's online, okay. Can you unmute him? My technician unmute. Professor Thomas?
I think he can do it himself also.
Yeah. Thomas, you are co-host, you can unmute yourself.
Doesn't work.
Okay, it's working now.
Now it's working? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. So I will say something about the second question, if that's okay.
That's okay.
And basically, I think that there are two very important dimensions in which that pressure can be brought to bear. One is from the side of African countries, and here it's key to have a unified front. For many, many decades, the developed rich do not give us the kind of friendly conditions for capital and the kind of cheap labor and cheap resources that we want, we will go to another country and make dealings with that other country. So if Africa can present a united front, it can make much more powerful demands on the richer countries. Because ultimately, the rich countries need the African resources. We cannot live without the resources from Africa. And so if you bargain collectively, you can get a much better deal. And of course, there's also a very powerful moral case that after colonialism, after slavery, after the genocides in Africa, the rich countries in the West have a strong responsibility to help make up for the developmental deficits that they themselves caused. The second dimension is the movement within the rich countries themselves. As you know, there is an explosion now of Black Lives Matter in the United States. And I think it's very important to show and bring in the global dimension of racism. This is not just an American problem, but it is a worldwide problem that has manifested itself in foreign policy. I mean, there's the famous thing that when the League of Nations was founded in 1919, there was a proposal that there should be a paragraph in the charter saying all races are equal. And the Anglo-Saxons defeated that. The Americans, the Australians, the British, they defeated this and said, no, the races are not equal. So racism is a problem with a long history. And what we should try to do, we meaning people in the richer countries, is to make the Black Lives Matter movement more sensitive to the international aspects of the problem. Basically saying we have a huge debt to Africa, and the least we can do is allow Africa to participate in green technologies and help through financing get Africa's development onto a green path, which will then also have its benefits for the rest of the world.
Thank you, Thomas.
Okay. Yep.
Go ahead, Emmanuel. Yeah.
Okay, so I think the question of the gentleman or the lady who mentioned that should Africa have its own bank? Yeah, I don't know whether that was a question actually, as many other. Of course, it's always a good idea as a continent to come together to improve our banking system, because if you have a critical look at the banking sector, you realize I'm not a financial or banking expert, but you realize that most of the existing banks that may be a bit of outside the continent ownership focus on corporate banking, and they actually support more of investment coming from within their countries than the retail kind of banking where the ordinary customer is being focused on and being financed. It is important also that as a continent, we have our own way of financing projects that we deem it fit, because if you continue to rely on others for your source of income, there's a likelihood that the conditions may be directed. The conditions that you'll be given for collecting such money may be directed to a certain aspect of your development that you wouldn't like it to be. So indeed, I think African Development Bank as an entity has gathered resources from other countries, even though most countries do not contribute as much as countries like Nigeria or Egypt. But we of course need to have our own source of money so that we can direct the development agenda of our own countries or our own continent. That is what I think I would like to contribute to that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Francois, if you don't mind, you can comment on the questions as you wish, but also, since you are both an economist and a theologian, you can also answer the question about the multiplicity of faiths and religious groups in Africa, and how that poses as a challenge or as an opportunity.
What is the second question about religious groups, please?
Let me repeat it. In a continent often permeated with religious influences, what could an interfaith perspective bring to greening the African economy and greening investment? What are the weaknesses of religious institutions in this field?
Okay, good. Thank you very much. So let me start first with the very first question about money creation by the banks. As a matter of fact, it's very important at this stage to distinguish what we would call central banks versus commercial banks. A central bank technically prints money. That is, they create it by making it, they use carbon, but they put their logo or stamp on it or something like that. This is, we say economically that they print the money. However, the commercial banks are those who are creating money. Actually, they create it through loans. If person A puts a deposit on the bank, what would happen? Can you hear me?
Yes, you can continue. I think I can hear you.
Like a seminar.
Okay, good. So when someone makes a deposit on the bank is able to use that deposit to make loans to actually many people. However, when they do the loans, there are requirements that are called reserve rates and so on. There are rules surrounding how they can make the loans. But they create money through the loans. And when they do the loans, they're actually financing economic activities. So to your question, yes, I think Africa definitely needs to have its own banks, because otherwise, as my colleague said, you cannot control what type of economic activities you are financing. If your banks are mostly, let's say, foreign banks, then they are kind of free, if I may say, to finance whatever pleases them. And whether it's on the side of printing the money or creating the money through loans, I think Africa needs to really master the economic system and the financial system, because otherwise, money and currency is a symbol of sovereignty. So you cannot let someone else manage it and then you pretend to be the master of your own destiny from the financial side. So definitely, I think that this is something that we need to look at seriously. On the point on an interfaith perspective for green development, I do think that the good aspect in Africa is that religion is very, very important. But the question we may ask is, how does religion matter for our own prosperity and for our own, let's say, well-being, or for the well-being of our people? As we are talking about green development, in some other countries, religious groups have come together to invest or to disinvest in some parts of the economy and to invest in green companies and so on. So I think an interfaith perspective would be to already come together and say, in Africa, religious groups or religious congregations or whatever want to only do business with sustainable companies and so on. That's possible. Let alone the fact that in terms of moral authority, religious groups have great moral authority in Africa, so they can also encourage their faithful to really care about sustainable development. And on that note, we need to focus on Laudato Si, the encyclical of Pope Francis, who really showed that actually the earth is our common house. Natural resources are common. There is a kind of universal destination of let's say, of the natural resources. And from that point of view, we need to use them in a very sustainable way, in a very ethical way. And I think that religious people are more likely to understand that type of message than other people. So I definitely do think that as we think about green growth, that is sustainable growth, a growth that doesn't hurt the earth, a growth that is inclusive, benefiting the most people, I do think that religions have a lot to do there. Otherwise, it would be a pity, because I think that we are those who should be more sensitive to green development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francois.
I wanted to add a little bit quickly about the religion and the interfaith stuff. Of course, they have grown. Now there is recognized that faith-based organizations are a critical players when it comes to environmental conservation, when it comes to green economy. More particularly, in my opinion, these faith-based organization or interfaith responsibility are based on these three pillars. I mean, Christians preach about dominion of the earth by humans, and they preach about the fact that we are also supposed to be stewards of the earth. And also, they also preach more particularly about empathy. So if you combine these together, we are stewards. It means we are responsible for our own environment, and we are responsible for what God has given to us. Empathy in the sense that we have been given a responsibility to care for each other. So you see a lot of religious groups that are putting up strategies at the local level to help people and make them more inclusive so that they can build their own socioeconomic activities. So I think religious-based organizations interface are playing roles about on stewardship and also on empathy when it comes to the preaching of their own and also dominion of how God has given to us to control the earth also, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can have the last set of questions. The first one is, who makes the rules? Yeah. Can we move the table, the decision-making table, to the center from Washington? That's the first one. The second one, I agree with Professor Thomas's analysis of the current intellectual property regime. But the question goes to all the panelists: how can Africa develop its own intellectual property regime focused on its own development? You can go ahead, Thomas. Any one of the two? Maybe you can focus on the second one addressed to you.
I think it needs to be on mute again. Okay.
Okay, does it work now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. So the intellectual property regime question I already answered to some extent. I think what we need is intellectual property rights that involve very different rewards from the one that we now have. Not the power to exclude, not a monopoly, but instead a reward for the impact. We should do that in pharmaceuticals. We should do that in green technologies. We should do that in agricultural innovations. In all these cases, we should spend public funds on rewarding those innovators who have a socially useful innovation in proportion to how much benefit that innovation produces. So if you have a medicine, let's say COVID-19, that saves 500,000 lives, then you should get rewarded in proportion to that health impact. If you have a green innovation that keeps so many million tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere, you should be rewarded for that in proportion. So this is something I have developed in great detail, and I think it's just a good way in which we can get innovation and access together. The present system gives us innovation, but without access. Many poor people don't get access to new things because they're too expensive. The compulsory licensing would give us access without innovation because it would kill off innovation. If you cannot benefit from the innovation, there would be much less of it. But these publicly funded reward pools that pay for impact, I think would be the right way forward to stimulate innovation and to reward it in a meaningful way, namely for the impact that it has in the world, regardless of whether the beneficiaries are rich or poor. Now, about who makes the rules, that is the most important question. And of course, currently, the rules for the world are made by governments. Governments are on the surface equal, but of course, in reality, they are very different in bargaining power. The US government is far more powerful than others. It uses its military might, its economic might, in order to get its way in many of these international negotiations. That happens in official fora, such as the UN and its sub-organizations, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on. But it also happens informally at conferences, for example, the UNFCCC, where you have talking about climate change and so on. In many different areas, there is this enormous inequality of power. Now, the US government and other very powerful governments, but mainly stay with the US, it in turn is influenced by the big corporations. The big corporations and their leading members are giving money to political parties, money for re-election campaigns. We are now in the middle of it. You know, we have Joe Biden against Trump here in the US fighting for the presidency. And this is all about money. Millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars are donated to the parties, to the candidates. And so ultimately, the US uses the power of the country for the benefit of a relatively small elite. And it's that elite that really is making the rules. Now, that can be disturbed and can be stopped even, but in order to disturb it or to stop it, we need a strong mobilization on the part of ordinary people, for example, US citizens, and we also need rule changes. For example, we have to get money out of politics. We have to make sure that people cannot donate unlimited amounts to political parties and political candidates. That is a struggle that is underway. We are fighting that struggle here in the US, but it is a long way to go. It is very, very difficult because we have to change the system as it is. And the present system is very strongly stacked against ordinary people and in favor of corporations and billionaires. So that's the Western perspective on the question of who makes the rules. And here we have to work together. You know, the opposition within the United States and the opposition to the global rules in the global South have to work together in order to present a united front against the common interest of the US and its allies. And it's of course deeply regrettable that we have now so much tension within the global South. tension, you know, the China-India thing, but there is a lot of, and that's always something that Western countries will support and try to sustain, that there is hostility and tension, that there is not a united front in the global South.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I'm watching my time, and I know it's very difficult to to make a professor summarize, but I will ask both the last two to both Francois and Emmanuel.
Right,
very quick comments on the questions.
Right. Yeah. Who makes the rule? That's actually a beautiful question, but this is a question of what is and what it should be. And almost what it is now is that Africans plays less role in the rulemaking, but what it should be is that every stakeholder, including Africa, should play that an important role in the decision making. And for those of you who are Christians, if you read Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7, it did indicate that the rich shall rule over the poor, and the borrower shall be a slave to the lender. And in this means that power balance is relying on the fact that he who have power influence the decision making. So it's up to us as Africans to reposition ourselves. Now, Africans should not become the cheapest human beings on earth. Countries in Asia have done that, and they had problems, but they were able to solve the problem despite the interference. So until Africans reorganize themselves and ensure that we have to move beyond what we are today and solve our own problems with little support from other places, no, we are not going to have a voice in the decision-making process. So that is what we need, a reorganization ourselves if you really want to play a part in the rule-making or the decision-making process in the world. Now, the second issue about how can Africa work on these intellectual properties. I have seen a lot of young entrepreneurs who come to me and tells me, I mean, I've met them with my time with MDF West Africa, who is a consultancy organization for entrepreneurs. Now, you see, these young people have marvelous ideas, but the fact is that they don't have support so that the ideas can be out there. Now, a rich man comes from outside, or perhaps an affluent person. He brings a lot of money and tells him, okay, this is your idea. I want to push the idea with this amount of money. And so your percentage will be maybe 2%. So then the young guy who really wants his idea to go on or move forward, just accept the 2% like that, or perhaps the 1%. So we have to create a system that supports our own people, our own entrepreneurs, that protects their right. Government need to play a critical role. The judiciary system, we need to build institutions that protect its own from such exploitation. If we do that, we'll be able to safeguard our own intellectual properties and our own innovations. It doesn't mean we should not share with the world, but we should share it with the right mindset. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Kabore, very quickly.
Okay, thank you very much. To the first question on who makes the rule, I would say it could be like a pleonasm, but the person who makes the rules are the person who can make the rules. That is the person who has the might to make the rules. So if Africans want to make the rules or be part of the people who are making the rules, they need to understand what is at stake in these rules, and they need to take the means to rise to the level of being able to care for their self-interest. And you do so by increasing your bargaining power. And this bargaining power for me is, Professor Thomas mentioned it, economic power, but I would say knowledge is what leads to economic and political power. You may sit there as politicians or as people representing X or Z, but you may not weigh that much. To the last question on the IP system, I think the contribution of my predecessor is very well taken. Actually, the issue is that the current IP system is based on private property. So if we want to reform that, we need to actually reform private property. And I think that ideas that are already thrown up by the, on the table by the Catholic Church on recognizing private property because it's the only way to also promote innovation, but to constrain it in a way that doesn't threaten common good. And of course, putting the rewards on impact instead of just inputs is very important. But I think the key issue of the current IP system in Africa, whether it's ARIPO, the African Regional Intellectual Property, or OAP, the Organisation Africaine de la Propriété Intellectuelle on the French side, or the coming Pan-African regional organization, it's really how we create an individual IP system, but constraining it so that it promotes common good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the panelists, Thomas, Emmanuel, and Francois, for the very insightful presentations and responses to our answers. This is meant to stimulate our reflection, our thinking, so that together we can continue to advance the work of justice, but especially on behalf of the poor. This series of webinars are being sponsored by the Jesuit Justice and Ecology Network of Africa, which is a diverse community of faith-inspired Jesuit NGOs, also called social centers, related Jesuit institutions, individual Jesuits, as well as our collaborators like Emmanuel here and Thomas, and other development activists and scholars who are driven by a vision of a just, poverty-free, peaceful, and ecologically regenerative Africa. So these discussions are meant to help us to drive change in that regard. I would like to also mention that we have had a couple of webinars on ecology and climate issues. We shall move on in 2 weeks' time. No, on the 29th of June, we shall have a webinar, but this one will be focused on migration and remittances. It will be within the framework of migration and development. As you know, migrants are also being impacted by COVID-19. Remittances also another facets of migration that we need to pay attention to. So we will speak to those on the 29th of June, which is Monday at 3 p.m. East African time. Today we had all three men. I promise you we will have gender balance on the next webinar. Thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you. And a good head to Thomas.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Quick recovery, Thomas. Quick recovery. We are thinking of you. We're praying for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Emmanuel. Goodbye. Thank you, Charlie.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.